Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on food waste from local to global to your own backyard. And my name is Lynn Dahman. I am the Managing Director of Purdue's Institute for a Sustainable Future. And we have several of our speakers who will be introduced one by one today. I'm happy to have Dr. Abby Engelberth, who is our co-lead for our research group in circular economies, moderating this discussion today. So she will go ahead and introduce folks and lead some discussion, and you can ask any questions you have in the Q&A feature along the bottom of your webinar browser. With no further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Abby.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. So I'm very happy to moderate this session. So this webinar is part of the ISF's Impact series, which highlights research, partnerships, and real-world action aimed at addressing complex sustainability challenges through interdisciplinary and systems-based approaches. Food waste is often thought of as a household or a consumer issue, but in reality, it spans global supply chains, national and state policy, community systems, and individual behaviors. Today's panel intentionally is structured to move from a global perspective down to the individual level, helping us understand both the scale of the problem and the diverse opportunities for action. We have a really excellent group of speakers who bring complementary expertise across economics, policy, community systems, and extension, and I'm excited to help guide today's conversation. So as Lynn said, I'm Abby Engelberth. I'm an associate professor in agricultural and biological engineering here at Purdue University, and I'm a faculty affiliate with the Institute for a Sustainable Future. I, along with Chad Laux from Purdue's School of Applied and Creative Computing, lead the Circular Economies Special Initiative within the ISF. My role is to help connect, as a moderator, is to help connect perspectives across scales, ensure that we stay on time, and facilitate discussion following the presentations. We'll reserve a substantial portion of the session for questions and panel discussion. Yes, like Lynn said, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in this Zoom as we move along. So we have 4 excellent speakers today. Our first speaker is Maksym Chepeliev, who will really set the stage with a global view of food waste within the broader food system. Dr. Chepeliev is a research assistant professor with the Center for Global Trade Analysis in Purdue's Department of Agricultural Economics. His work focuses on global food systems, trade, diets, and sustainability, with particular attention to food loss and waste across international supply chains. Today, Dr. Chepeliev will present on how food waste fits in the global food system, how it intersects with planetary boundaries, trade, and dietary patterns, and why addressing food loss and waste is essential for improving food security and sustainability worldwide. This global framing will provide the important context for more localized perspectives that follow. Building from the global scale, our next speaker will bring the discussion of the state and household level. Dr. Brenna Ellison is a professor at Purdue University and the director of the Center for Food Conservation and Waste Reduction, which is a USDA designated center focused on reducing food waste and improving nutrition security. Her work combines behavioral research with applied interventions, helping households better manage food through education, tools, and tailored strategies. Dr. Ellison will share insights from state-level research in Indiana, highlighting how targeted, household-centered approaches can meaningfully reduce food waste while improving food management, confidence, and follow-through. From the state level, we'll shift to the community and city scale. Kate Howe is the executive director for the Indie Hunger Network, where she leads collaborative efforts to address systemic hunger and eliminate disparities across the greater Indianapolis hunger relief system. Her work centers on coordination among food banks, food pantries, nonprofits, government agencies, and donors to ensure that surplus food is redirected and efficiently and equitably to those who need it most. Kate will discuss how redirecting food to food banks and pantries can simultaneously reduce waste and increase food availability, and how community-level infrastructure and collaboration play a critical role in making that possible. Our final speaker will focus on what individuals and communities can do locally, particularly through composting, and community food systems. Nathan Schoaf is an urban agricultural assistant program leader with Purdue Extension. His work emphasizes local composting and urban agricultural and the role of community scale systems in conserving nutrients with strengthening food security. Today, Nathan will explore how food waste can be transformed into a resource through local and community-based composting, how these practices support local farms and food systems, and how individual participation plays a really critical role in closing nutrient loops at the local level. To start, it's important that we understand the scale and the challenge and how food waste fits into the global system. Setting that context will really help frame everything that follows. With that, I'll turn it over to Maksym, who will begin by taking us to the global level.
Great. Thank you, Abby. Thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to participate in this webinar. So in my presentation, as Abby mentioned, I will try to provide like a broad global picture. The presentation is titled From Diets to Waste, Understanding the Global Food System. So I will start with more of a food system perspective and provide a bit of a context why, what environmental pressures and impact food system generates, obviously, by supporting, by providing food to over 10 billion people around the world, and why it is important to address a food loss and waste challenge. So when we look at the food system as a whole, it of course provides, feeds, as I mentioned, 10 billion people around the world, but it also creates quite a bit of, resource use through that. So there is a notion of planetary boundaries, which are essentially a different environmental dimensions. And when we try to identify what environmental dimensions are pressured by the food system, and you can see it on this slide, it includes fertilizer application, land use change, climate change, novel entities use, and so on. We see that food system contributes quite to the transgression of quite a few of these dimensions. And this quantification, for instance, here comes from our recent paper with colleagues published at Lancet last year. And despite producing enough food to feed 10 billion people, the distribution of food is uneven, and there is a major hunger pressure. 1 in 10 people are at risk of hunger worldwide. At the same time, in high-income countries, there is this issue of multiple burdens of malnutrition. That's when you can find both obesity and malnutrition, inefficient intakes of micronutrients in many households. And food loss and waste is an essential part of the global food system, and it has its unique challenges and also opportunities. So reducing global food loss and waste is an important issue, and it lies in the center of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda. When we look into what are the impacts of food loss and waste generated along the food supply chains, there have been many studies showing that it contributes substantially to climate change, to natural resource depletion, threatens economic stability and also food security due to lowering the food availability. And addressing this challenge in a global, comprehensive way requires as a first step a proper quantification of the magnitude, composition, geographical location of lost and discarded foods, and which would help to design specific policy interventions. So later today, other speakers would talk about more local perspective of food loss and waste, but quantifying and understanding it in the global kind of context, it's really challenging. And once you start looking what is available in terms of food loss and waste kind of global perspective, you will find that there are no really global and reliable estimates. Different studies use different definitions of food loss and waste, so it's really hard to compare them. No good quantification along the supply chain when you start to understand what stages of food loss and waste kind of are quantified, and many studies would use different metrics, so it's hard to compare. While when we look into their impacts, we want to understand both, for instance, environmental impacts, economic impacts, and so on. So in a series of recent studies, we have try to address some of these challenges and identify limitations, providing better quantification of both historical but also future food loss and waste trends and the alternative kind of assumptions and scenarios, both in the US but also worldwide. So essentially, in the rest of the presentation, I will talk about some of our recent research in this area. So the first step that we have implemented was to construct a new global food loss and waste database. And this is an example of the study that we published a couple of years ago with colleagues from Wageningen in Nature Food. And there we developed a new global database that quantifies food loss and waste along the supply chain, along the stages of the supply chain. So we distinguished 5 food loss and waste stages, from agricultural production to post-harvest handling, manufacturing, distribution, and retail and consumption. So the last 2 stages, distribution, retail, and consumption, then they correspond to waste, while first 3 stages correspond to food loss. And then we link the stages to their global food supply chain. And essentially, our work improves on some of the earlier work done by colleagues at the FAO. So this is an upper part of the slide on the right. And red parts here show kind of what supply chain stages over what commodities have been identified in their earlier FAO work, and our identification is at the bottom. So as you can see, we have quantified much more commodity supply chain country-specific stages, providing a much more kind of comprehensive view of the global food loss and waste. Now, with this, we are now in a much better position to quantify the food loss and waste along the supply chain. So this is a global perspective. So we start from their food production, and then we go stage by stage, commodity by commodity, and we estimated, for instance, that global food loss and waste along the supply chains accounts for almost 2 billion metric tons globally, and we quantified the location in terms of distribution of food loss and waste. That, for instance, in case of low-income countries, most food loss and waste happens at the production stage due to inefficient technology, while in the case of high-income countries like US, it's mostly the consumption level because of their high food affordability and essentially households' decision, for instance, to contribute to more food waste at the final household consumption level. So there are other examples for other countries, but that's kind of their broad picture. And we also, once looking at historical trends, we found that food loss and waste globally has been increasing over time. So over the decades that we have analyzed, it has increased by over 20%. So the pressure has been growing. We also, with the frameworks that we have developed, we can also quantify kind of how food loss and waste is embedded in traded food. And depending on whether the country is net exporter or net importer on food, that would kind of define how their food loss and waste embedded in trade stands. So, for instance, in the case of US, considering that it is a net food importer, we found that there are substantial volumes of food loss and waste embedded in imports of food, while for instance, Brazil, being a large agricultural exporter, essentially has a large export of food loss and waste in its trade. Why it is important? Because it shows you over what food loss and waste stages and commodities you have control over, direct or indirect, right? If your food is imported, you, for instance, might not have control over cutting food loss at the production stage if it is produced, for instance, in Brazil or in Mexico. So in the case of US, looking, comparing it also with other countries, we found that the United States have relatively high amount of lost and discarded calories per capita. So once you compare globally, it's around 1,800 calories per capita per day in terms of food supply versus net intake, right? And it's comparable or even larger than many other high-income countries like Canada or New Zealand. In terms of their allocation of food loss and waste along the supply chain, as I mentioned before, we found that it's particularly consumption stage where most of food loss and waste is concentrated in the US, and it's even further stresses the motivation for focusing on food waste in the case of US that speakers later today will be discussing. In terms of commodity composition, we have been finding that substantial share of food loss and waste in US is related to cereal grains, but also horticulture, oilseeds, sugar crops, although some of that is embedded, for instance, as a feed in their livestock products as well. Now, going forward, what are the challenges to the food system in general and food loss and waste in particular, and how those could be addressed? Of course, there are many kind of potential interventions and policies that can be implemented locally or for specific food commodities. But there are also more global, broad style policies that might interact with both food system sustainability, but also food loss and waste. So in another kind of set of papers, we, in collaboration with the Eat Lancet Commission, who is essentially looking into their transitioning to healthy and more sustainable diets globally, we have explored the interaction between dietary transition and food loss and waste reduction. So some of the findings are have been published in the Lancet journal. And here we have been focusing particularly on the impacts of transitioning to healthier and more sustainable diet. In terms of what are the dietary kind of patterns guidelines that we have considered, so these have been aligned with nutritional scientists that have been part of this Eat Lancet Commission, and they have shared with us specific kind of dietary guidelines in terms of intakes of various food groups that are aligned with healthy diet. And then what we did, we have developed a specific set of modeling tools and kind of comprehensive assessment approaches that allows us to evaluate various hypothetical long-term scenarios. In this case, we're looking till 2050 in terms of the evolution of food system. So for instance, on the figure on the left, you can see how our kind of reference or baseline scenario looks in terms of caloric intakes in this case, in various countries. The red line shows US. So essentially in the reference, we assume that the currently observed diet composition and, caloric intake stay in place. And then we look
Maksym, 2 minutes, okay? 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And then we looked into various types of scenarios that include a transition to healthier diet, so changing your preferences towards more healthier foods, and B, reduction in food loss and waste along the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which includes halving 50% reduction in food loss and waste, in our case, by 2050. So what we found is that when we transition to healthy diets per se, it helps to reduce food loss and waste to some extent. So this is purple line here, but not substantially, right? So it's still food loss and waste on the baseline scenario increases over time, and the dietary transition scenario, it kind of stays constant, but it's really a combination of both dietary transition and food loss and waste reduction that helps to achieve over 60% reduction in food loss and waste over time. We also kind of, with this framework, we can trace how food loss and waste embedded in trade kind of changes with transitioning to healthy diets, and kind of in some cases there are rebound effects. For instance, healthy diet is heavy on vegetable fruits and nuts, which are relatively kind of food loss and waste intensive. So there could be some spillovers there. But when it is combined with food loss and waste reduction, then we can achieve reduction in both domestically kind of generated, but also food loss and waste embodied into trade. So let me conclude with some key takeaway messages from my presentation. So first, when we look at the global level, there is really lack of comprehensive global estimates of food loss and waste across countries, commodities, supply stages. In recent work, we try to address some of these gaps, but of course, much more need to be done. There have been historically increasing food loss and waste over time, both in the US and globally. And if current trends continue, we are estimating that food loss and waste globally could increase by over 50% by 2050. So that's definitely a challenge. If households, if consumers change their diets towards healthier ones, it does help to address food loss and waste challenge, but doesn't really bend the curve. So much more need to be done, which essentially targeted food loss and waste reduction policies, which later speakers will also discuss in a more local scale. So when both are combined, yes, it does help to substantially reduce food loss and waste. I will also note that there are some kind of implications in terms of specific interventions on food loss and waste reduction from our work. So for low-income countries, we find that technological innovations at the production level would be of particular importance. While in high-income countries, including US, we find that plant-based agricultural losses could be a point of specific focus and, could be used to increase the production sustainability. And finally, just one point in terms of some of the ongoing works that we are currently doing, and we'll be happy to discuss it further if there are any follow-up questions. So we are now working with nutritionists to better understand kind of food waste trends historical over time. So for that, we are comparing estimated net caloric intakes and food intakes from kind of surveys and body mass index kind of estimates. And we're also looking into specific market interventions that might help to reduce food loss and waste. With that, there are some estimates done by the colleagues at the OECD. So we are trying to kind of implement those policies in our assessment frameworks. With that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Maksym, for grounding us in the global food system and the magnitude of food loss and waste worldwide. Now we'll bring it to the global perspective a bit closer to home and look at how food waste shows up in the state and household level. Brenna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Abby. Give me a quick second to share. All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I'm happy to be joining on the webinar today. So my name is Brenna Ellison. As Abby mentioned at the start, I serve as director for the Center for Food Conservation and Waste Reduction, and I'm a professor in agricultural economics here at Purdue. For those of you who might not be familiar with our center, I do want to just give a quick introduction to what we do. So we are funded by USDA NIFA, and we were established to work specifically with households to reduce food waste while also improving nutrition security. And then there was also a mandate to really engage the next generation in food waste reduction. So those are kind of some overarching goals we have for our center here at Purdue. So how are we doing it? So I did want to put in a plug for some of the things we're doing. We do have an established website, conservefood.org. This is kind of an image from our homepage. And this is meant to serve as a consumer or household-facing resource to learn how to better manage food at home and reduce waste. To that end, one of our deliverables was also to create a curated resource library. So what I'm showing you here is the different filters you could use to find resources. And again, these resources are designed for households or people who work to educate households on how to improve their food management behavior. And so if you need resources on meal planning or avoiding the landfill, which I know Nathan will talk about later, serving food, food storage, all sorts of things, you can sort that way. If you want to work with kids specifically, there are also really great resources that are made with kids in mind. But you could also sort by a video versus a toolkit and things like that. So in the event you know of a resource that we're missing, please send it our way. We look to add 6 to 8 new resources every month to the library, so we're always open to new ideas. So in thinking more from like a state and a more local level at how we're working on tackling food waste, one thing that we have been really interested to try is more tailored interventions to help households better manage their food. And I also just really want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the generous funding support we had from the Purdue Ag Seed program and our partners that helped us carry out the project in Purdue Extension. So let me jump in. Again, I think we've talked about it a little bit, but why are we targeting households? We know that when we look across the supply chain, they are one of the largest generators of food waste, mostly because there's so many of them, right? So when we aggregate them, there's a lot of waste. So that's why we focus on households. So now I want to convince you why we might care about tailored interventions. So we know that households are top contributors to waste, but rarely do they all behave in the same way. So they have really heterogeneous food management behaviors for a variety of reasons. It could be you have kids in your home, or you live alone, or right, there could be a number of factors that impact that. And a lot of the initiatives that we have right now from like a policy perspective often try to reduce food waste in a top-down nature and take more of a one-size-fits-all approach. So an example would be like date labeling education. So that's great. Date labels do contribute to confusion and can lead to waste, but not everyone might rely on date labels in the same way. And so again, like we want to think about how do we give households a little bit of agency in thinking about what works best for them. So in the project I want to present some early results on today, we really aim to take a more personalized approach and let households self-select their own intervention to reduce waste at home. We want to do this to improve buy-in. So again, when you get some agency in the process, you might be more willing to follow through on what you're selecting. And it allows you to tailor it to your own environment and behavior. So hopefully it's more likely to be effective in that sense. So here is what we tried for our Ag Seed project study design. We did this in 5 different communities here in Indiana, and we structured it as a randomized controlled trial. So here's what we had people do. We recruited people to come in and have a 1-hour session with us, and this is called our baseline session. And so all participants come and they complete a household food management survey, and then they go home and do a 5-day food waste audit. So during this 1-hour session, they complete the survey and we train them on how to do their food waste audit at home. We give them a scale, we give them measuring cups, and we give them a lot of guidance, and they're measuring both edible and inedible waste. So everyone does that at baseline. Once the baseline assessment is complete, then participants are randomized into either a treatment group or a control group, which is actually, we're calling it a delayed treatment, which I'll explain in just a moment. So for the folks that get randomized into our treatment group, we have a one-on-one interview with them, with a member of our research team, and we essentially talk to them about what they learned in tracking their own waste at home for 5 days. So we ask them, what sorts of things led to waste, and how do you think you could do better? And so during that interview process, people could identify things that they thought would help them do better managing their food at home. Again, that can span the gamut of lots of food resource management activities, including better planning. I need clear storage containers. I could use a compost bin, like lots of different things that could happen. And so we help them select that intervention. We also help fund it, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then they get 30 days to try it out. For the control group, we don't interact with them for 30 days. They continue to behave as normally. And then after the 30-day period, we ask both groups to do a 1-month follow-up where they take the same survey again. and do another 5-day food waste audit. So obviously our hypothesis is that we hope we're seeing changes in the treatment group. We hope to see reduced waste. We hope to see improved confidence in food management skills, whereas the control group really, we would expect no change. And then because we thought our intervention was quite unique and we didn't want to deny people who just were randomized into the control group the opportunity to do it, we also then delivered a delayed treatment once they had completed the 2 required parts of the study. So those folks could also do an interview and then select an intervention to try out at home. So interventions, as I said, they get to self-select them. So that's kind of hard because it leaves it a lot more open-ended as to what it could be. So this is where we spent time working with Purdue Extension educators to identify potential intervention options. But participants also had the option to go off list. So again, we think about the whole continuum of managing food. And I think something really unique that we got to try in this study was for each household that participated, they had a budget of up to $100 to select their intervention items. And so some households opted to use all of the $100, some opted to use none of it, but that was available to essentially reduce the financial risk of experimentation in trying something new to improve how you manage food at home. So this is, again, early preliminary data from our project. So you can see here the most common intervention types that people selected. This is among our treatment group, so we're not including those delayed control participants. One thing I want to point out is on average, a household would select about 3 items, or an individual would select just short of 3 items per person. So it could be they asked us for educational resources plus an actual physical product or something of that nature. We found food storage was by far one of the most popular things people wanted to purchase. So there was a lot of clear storage containers to improve visibility of food, whether that be in their pantry or their refrigerator. Several people were also interested in vacuum sealers in the event they were buying in bulk but couldn't use their food. This was a way to help extend shelf life for those products, as well as like silicone molds and other things that could be helpful in freezer storage. So food storage was a big category. We also had several people that wanted things related to food prep and cooking. So you see an Instapot here, but we also had people maybe who were already really efficient with their food talk about, they don't always know what to do with scraps. And so we found a few different scraps cookbooks that they could have used or tried. And then again, just small appliances that might help people make their food go further at home. And then the last category that was fairly common among participants was meal planning. So we had several people who wanted to try a magnetic menu planning board on their refrigerator to try to keep them sticking with the plan that they actually set. There were also folks who wanted to try a meal planning app that tried to help them keep track of what they had in their kitchen and then plan for the week. So these were the broad categories, but again, we also had people select composters and other sorts of things, but this gives you an overview of where people thought they needed the most help at home. And then, what did they think about them? I think something really encouraging about this project is that when people got to self-select their own interventions, the vast majority actually were implemented. So we had over 95% of items were implemented at home. The ones that weren't was usually a function of insufficient time. And then most participants rated them easy to implement. So we had a really high average here, and also viewed them to be successful in their mind at helping them manage their food better. The other part that I wanted to share, I won't read all of these, but this is qualitative feedback from participants about the different interventions. And this, again, really re-energizes me as a researcher because you can tell the impact was very real. So on the top left, it talks about they bought silicone cube trays because they always had more milk than they can use. And so this was an idea where they could actually pre-portion half cup servings of milk in these silicone molds, and then they could use them in things later and not have to keep buying more milk and also throwing it out. You can see on the top right, they got a menu planning board and it helped them. They said, I'm not perfect, but it was much improved from the first part of the study. And we thought that was really good to hear. And then at the bottom right, I just want to note this person got a vacuum sealer and also had some meal planning ideas or resources that they used. And so at the bottom is what really sticks out to me. Together, these things made our kitchen more organized, budget-friendly, and stress-free. So that's exactly what we're going for, is helping people better manage food at home and hopefully making their lives easier as well. So where do we go from here? So we have really encouraging early results, but we're still digging into the data. So one thing we want to know is, did the intervention impact actual waste outcomes? So we need to go through those waste audits, which is a lot of data cleaning, which we're in the process of now. We also want to see how it impacts satisfaction and confidence with food management. We're also interested in, again, based on that last quote I mentioned, how do these interventions help with perceived stress at home? So can we help reduce stress, which is something a lot of households experience when we talk about food management? And then a bigger, step back picture, does this have impacts on food or nutrition security at home? So those are the things that we are working with our data to try and answer. And then I think stepping back a bit again, like how, is there potential to scale this type of intervention, or what are other ways we can think about reducing the risk of experimentation for households? So sometimes we're just unwilling to make those investments in ourselves if we're not sure they work. And so this was a great opportunity for us to help bring that barrier down for households and let them try something new. So with that, I will stop here, Abby, and I appreciate you giving me time to present today.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Brenna. So Brenna really showed us what intervention can look like inside the home, but those household actions are connected to much larger community systems. So Kate will now help us understand how food waste and food access intersect across a city and regional hunger relief network. The screen is yours, Kate.
Thanks, Abby. Let me get my slides up here. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. I've already learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the last speaker as well. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that Indie Hunger Network has been doing to try to reduce food waste in the charitable food assistance system through food banks and food pantries. And this is these efforts are really focused on trying to get food out of the waste system by using it better. So making sure that excess food that can't be sold at the sort of corporate level is getting into the charitable food system to be used by people who need help with food. So I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit about our organization. Oh,
Kate, before you move forward, can you switch your displays so that we see the big screen instead of the presenter mode?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I didn't
That's
realize
okay.
that you were seeing that. Let me.
I think there's yep. Perfect.
Did that work?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know. So going back to this slide, so Indie Hunger Network is a collaborative organization made up of a bunch of other nonprofit organizations, as well as some corporate partners and government agencies. And really our goal, we work in the greater Indianapolis area, and our goal is to bring these folks together to look at problems in the food system, the charitable food system primarily, and address food insecurity through collaborative projects, advocacy, and research. And so I'm going to tell you about some work that we've done as a collaborative through Indie Hunger Network, and then I'm going to just highlight the work of a couple of our partners on food, reducing food waste through their work as well. To set the stage a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar with food insecurity in Indiana, Indie Hunger Network did a study in collaboration with IU last year to look at food insecurity in central Indiana. So we were looking at Marion County, where Indiana is located, and then the 8 counties surrounding Indianapolis. And we did a web-based survey with a panel through Qualtrics, and we found, after asking people about their situation, that 54% of people in our area were reporting food insecurity. 54% of respondents, I should say, to be clear, but it was over 1,300 people that participated in the survey. And there are lots of different ways to measure food insecurity, and there are different numbers you'll see in different studies. But really, this was pretty eye-opening that 54% of people in our area were reporting that in the last year they had had some period of food insecurity. And, much higher than we would have expected. And then we also looked at low versus very low food security. And of those people who were food insecure or had experienced food insecurity, 37% of them were saying that their food security was very low. So it's a pretty significant problem. We look at lots of different ways to try to address food insecurity. And so I'll talk about some of those solutions in a little bit. I also wanted to point out that this was not an Indianapolis problem. We talked to folks in rural, suburban, and urban areas of this 9-county region and found the same level of food insecurity across the region. So it's not, people in cities are struggling or people in rural areas are struggling. It's everybody across every county, across every neighborhood in Indiana, we're finding food insecurity. And, with the rising cost of rent and food and the cuts in federal programs, we're finding our neighbors being more in need than we have in the recent past. Just in particular, households with children are at higher risk of food insecurity. More mouths to feed with fewer wage earners can cause strains on the budget. We found that 86% of the people reporting food insecurity in our survey had at least one wage earner in the home. So they're working families, they're people that are trying to make ends meet and can't do that with the wages that they're earning. People who are self-employed were more likely to be food insecure. And then, as I mentioned before, both rural and urban and suburban households are experiencing food insecurity. We look across at Indie Hunger Network, we're looking across the entire hunger relief system to try to understand where are the places that we could make improvements, where are the places that we could be connecting people better to the resources that are available. So this is a map that one of our board members made many years ago, but we use it a lot to kind of illustrate how complicated the food assistance system is. So if you're somebody on the left, somebody who's experiencing food insecurity, trying to figure out where you can get food, there are lots of organizations providing lots of different programs, lots of different funding sources, and therefore restrictions on who can access them. It's really, really a complicated system. And we've found that this also impacts food donors. So as I switch a little bit to talking about our food waste work, in conversations with our food bank partners back in 2016, we were hearing that there were semi-drivers who would show up at the food bank and say, I'm so glad I found you. I have a load of broccoli that I can't deliver at the Walmart distribution center because they said that they already received the same order yesterday. I've got to go to Ohio and pick up another load. Can I give you this broccoli? This was a thing that kept coming up where truck drivers weren't able to find places to donate food. They might show up at a food bank and the food bank said, our cooler is full, we can't take whatever you have. And so a lot of that food was getting thrown away. So it was both the often fresh produce, because that's something that goes bad quickly. And they were they were paying to dump those loads at the dump, and they were also throwing out the containers that the food came in. So it was just creating all kinds of waste. And that's food that could be helping feed people in the food assistance system. And so we created a program called Food Drop through Indie Hunger Network. And it was a very simple idea just to connect those truck drivers easily with a place that they could donate food. So in the early days, we just had a phone number listed on our website. People could call us and say, I'm in Muncie and my truck broke down and I have 10 pallets of milk that I need to get off the truck or they're going to go bad. Can somebody take this milk? So it's always food that is edible. It's in good shape. It's been cared for well. It's not, there's nothing wrong with it. It just can't get to its destination for some reason. It could be truck breaks down. It could be, like I said, a duplicate order. It could be a quality issue. We've heard about issues where somebody shows up at the grocery store to deliver melons and the melons are too small. They have a hoop test to figure out if the melons meet quality standards, and if they don't meet that test, the load is rejected. So again, still good food, but just not, the retailer thinks it's not easy to sell this product because it doesn't quite meet the standards that people expect. So getting that food into the food bank and then food pantry system means more fresh and healthy food for people that are using those charitable resources. So, for a while we were doing this where we would just have folks call us if they had something that they wanted to donate. And then our staff would start calling food banks and food pantries and saying, hey, this truck driver is up in Gary and they've got 3 pallets of broccoli. Can you take that? And they might say, we're closed today. And so then we'd call the next one. And it was just a lot of back and forth trying to navigate and coordinate that. And a few years ago, we heard from Dr. Alex Somas. This is a picture of him. He's a professor at Purdue in the computer science department, and he reached out asking if we had any data needs. We started talking with him about food drop, and he said, we could make that a lot easier for you by automating that system. And so he and his graduate students worked with us. We got a Google AI for Social Good grant. And they started working on a system to make that food drop program work better. And what they did was talk with us about who the food banks are, how we wanted to prioritize donations. So for instance, we said, well, this food bank, they're open a lot and they get a lot of the donations, but the other food banks are a little annoyed that so much of it goes to this one place. Could we prioritize food banks that haven't gotten a donation in a while? So we did that. We included that. We also included the distance from where the truck driver was to the food bank or food pantry, the donation site, to try to minimize the distance that they would have to drive to make a donation and other things like that. So I'm going to just show you a little bit about what that looks like now. So if you go to the Food Drop website, you find this donation form, and it asks you about, do you have at least 1 pallet of produce to donate? What we're not looking for is somebody cleaning out their pantry because they're about to move and they want to donate the food. That's more like call a food pantry and give it to them. We're looking for big quantities of food. And then we also ask them to verify that they're willing to receive SMS notifications on their phone, because once they go through this questionnaire, that's how the communication takes place. So they will be asked a question about what type of food they're donating. They could write asparagus or ice cream or whatever it might be. How is it packaged? Is it refrigerated, frozen, or shelf stable? All of this helps us to get the information we need to communicate with the donation sites to see if they want the product. Next, they'll enter their donation quantity. Is it in pallets, cases, or pounds? And then why was it rejected? So this is really important. We don't want to pass on bad food. We don't want to pass on something that isn't going to be usable when it gets to the end location. So if they select quality reasons, this is the set of questions that they'll get. Is it because of spoilage, decay, temperature, etc.? Is it cosmetic issues? That's one quality issue that would still make it okay if, that we heard about a load of romaine lettuce that showed up at a food bank because the romaine lettuce stems were twisted. So they didn't look normal, but it's just lettuce and it tastes like lettuce and it's still good food to eat. So that's something that we would accept a load for, but many of these things would cause the load to be rejected. And if it's a logistic reason, that's something that those are the types of problems that we're really trying to solve. So an ordering mistake, they ordered too much, the product is mislabeled, so it can't be sold in stores, things like that. So we ask for all of this information, as well as where they're located, where they're going to. So say a driver is coming from South Bend and they're heading to Kentucky, then we could look for locations along that I-65 corridor or near there that would be on the way to their next stop. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for these drivers to donate food instead of taking it to the dump. And then estimated departure time. So what day do you need to donate it? What time are you leaving? How quickly do you need an answer? And then once they've put all of this information in, then it goes to this text system where there's an automated text messaging system that will send out text messages to different locations. So say it goes to Second Harvest Food Bank, then they will have 15 minutes to say yes or no to that load. If they say yes, then it's theirs, and the system will connect the driver and the food bank. If they say no, then it will go to the next one based on the algorithm of distance, how long it's been since they last received a donation, things like that. And if that food bank doesn't respond in that 15 minutes, it'll still go to the next person in line so that the driver isn't left waiting for hours while we try to shuffle through all the possible donation sites. And so it's just been a really good partnership. We're really grateful for Dr. Somas and his team reaching out to us and taking on this project and making our lives easier. Now, it really takes minimal staff input from Indie Hunger Network and our partners to make the program run. And we're redirecting lots of edible food that would be wasted and is now going into the charitable food assistance system. Uh, Last year, we decided that Indie Hunger Network was no longer going to be the owner of the food drop program, so we actually passed it off to Society of St. Andrew, which is one of our member organizations. And I want to talk a little bit about their work. They are an organization, it's actually a nationwide organization based in Virginia, but they have a branch here in Indiana. And they do something pretty cool where they have teams of volunteers that go out to farm fields and glean excess produce and then donate that to food pantries. So, for example, there's a U-Pick apple orchard, I think somewhere in Hamilton County, just north of Indianapolis. And after families have come with their kids and picked all the apples they want, there are still apples to be harvested. They may not have all been ripe at the time that families were doing the U-Pick. They just may have been less efficient in harvesting. And so these teams of volunteers will go out there and pick the excess apples and then actually gather them and take them for delivery to a food pantry. And so they're doing that with farm fields, they're doing that with community gardens, and they even do it at farmers markets. So they'll have folks that go to the farmers market, and at the end of the market day, they'll take any excess produce to be donated and make sure it gets delivered to a hunger relief organization. And then lastly, I wanted to just mention Second Helpings. I see a couple of Second Helpings folks are on this webinar today, so thanks for listening in. They're another Indianapolis nonprofit organization that does really good work with reducing food waste, and they do it by they're gathering both unused ingredients like produce and meat, things like that, from supermarkets, from restaurants, and catering companies, but they're also collecting prepared foods. So, there are lots and lots of hotels in the conference center in downtown Indianapolis that are preparing catered meals every single day. And there is always food that doesn't get served because someone doesn't show up. And that food can be reused. If it hasn't left the kitchen, that food can be reused for the hunger relief system. So Second Helpings has a team of folks that go out, volunteers and some paid staff that go out in vehicles every single day around central Indiana, and they pick up that food, bring it back to their location, and you can see a picture here of their prep kitchen. So they take that food and repurpose it into meals that then they send back out into the community to community centers, shelters, group homes, after-school programs, all kinds of organizations throughout the area that are feeding people and can benefit from the free meals that they're able to provide. So it's a really unique way of making sure that good edible food is getting reused, even if it can't be used at the place that it was originally intended to be used. And that is all I had to share today, but I'd be happy towards the end to answer any questions and love to hear more from any of you that are interested in this work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kate. So Kate really highlighted the importance of systems and collaboration in addressing hunger and waste. Our final speaker will focus on what action looks like on the ground, particularly at the neighborhood and community scale. So Nathan, I will hand it over to you.
Are you able to see my presentation? I know it's
We can.
it's now
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
great.
That's great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you everyone from the ISF for Abby for hosting us today, and to the previous speakers, great presentations, and I hope hopefully this takes some of that information and contextualizes more of a local or community-based approach. And my name is Nathan Schoaf, and I serve as the Agriculture and Natural Resources Assistant Program Leader in Extension and an Urban Agriculture Specialist. So I'll share a little bit of my thoughts on that and how that extension role kind of overlaps with some of these topics. And my presentation today will focus on from plate to plot, conserving nutrition through composting and community food systems. And I want to kind of start off by why local composting matters. I think Kate did kind of a great job setting the stage for this and talked about some of these topics in her talk, but this really is a great opportunity to keep nutrients in the system. Compost can retain a lot of key plant nutrients that you can then return to nearby soils. It's an opportunity to reduce nutrient loss. So there's a lot of distance traveled. Often a lot of farmers I support or work with talk about long distances to haul materials to get on site in the farm and whatnot, or centralized waste systems. And that can often lead to nutrient loss through leachate and emissions. And I think this is a really great opportunity to kind of reframe this discussion. I know other states have different programs, using the loop term and circular economy terminology that I think is really aligns well with a lot of research initiatives. But ultimately, it's taking food waste, turning it to compost, incorporating it into the soil, and then bringing that back into food production. So I want to highlight some kind of, I think, key kind of types of community-based composting, or kind of the role of community-scale composting. So often when I see a lot of neighborhood composting hubs, and you see this picture on the right here of, this is in Portland, Maine. This is a really, really great system they have in place, or initiative they have in place, where it's all over the city. Folks drop off their food scraps. There's really clear signage, really clear information. There's a lot of community buy-in. The stakeholders in the community are not really anticipating anything other than maybe purchasing some of those fruits from the gardens, community gardens, or urban farms, but they're not anticipating getting anything in return from that other than it being a great opportunity to distribute that food waste and not landfill those materials. So a lot of different cities do this to varying degrees, but I want to highlight that one. I thought it was just a really nice snapshot of that. Community gardens with composting systems and programs. I've seen this a lot in Indianapolis, also in Bloomington, where really kind of the impetus behind that too is to keep the kind of the site management or the soil management aspects more consistent, so that folks aren't bringing in a lot of different materials. It's reducing that hauling, that cost barrier for a lot of farmers who want to do that, maybe want to manage more organically, but lack the opportunity to do so. School and university composting programs are really great opportunities for education, building awareness, highlighting unique opportunities and ways to really achieve success through composting, and maybe kind of a lot of demonstrations related to various feedstocks and how you can really improve your composting. And then finally, small municipal or nonprofit sites. These are often framed around, really focusing on equity, making sure that compost is available for growers, especially those who can't afford it or maybe don't have access to be able to transport that to their site. I want to talk here a little bit too about the role of local farms. This is in the space where myself and a lot of my extension colleagues work, where soil fertility management is really important, and this can be a really valuable resource for that. Often the talk is focused on reduced dependence on synthetic fertilizers. I'll talk a little bit about this in another slide with some data, but I want to mention this with a caveat. I know many people are really interested in this now with high fuel prices, maybe some supply chain disruptions, but often want to tell farmers too that while, if you're solely just composting some of your vegetable scraps or yard waste, that's a great thing to do, and there are a lot of nutrients available there. They may not be as dense as you might find in some other feedstocks as manure-based compost and other things. So this is where soil testing can really come important. I don't want to get too sidetracked with that, but this is another area where I think that monitoring that, being very intentional, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing in some of these systems where continued, application of the same type of compost year after year, even decades long, can really lead to some negative impacts. But this is a really great opportunity for safe reuse of organic waste. Farmers can incorporate this into their production systems, and I'll highlight a little bit later how they do so. In particular, in the context of urban farms, we're often dealing with farmers who have compacted, degraded, or contaminated soils, and so this can be used. Compost is often used as an amendment to dilute contaminants by adding that to potentially contaminated soils, and other opportunities too to mobilize heavy metals, especially depending on feedstocks and pH and other soil chemical factors as well. I want to share some data, a couple of slides of data from a USDA AFRI project I've been involved with, where we surveyed 500 small to medium scale farmers, and we asked a lot of questions related to compost use in vegetable production, and focusing really on specialty crops, which aligns well with most of the farmers I work with in urban settings. About 90% are growing specialty crops in vegetable production particularly. But many are using organic waste inputs like food scraps I mentioned earlier, straw, Many are using manure to kind of balance those different feedstocks. It's a great way to boost microbial diversity. We see a lot of survey data related to that. Nutrient and water retention. And it's widely adopted with over 90% of vegetable growers in our survey. We see very similar findings too in a lot of our statewide or county-based needs assessment. So a lot of folks really engaged in this too and frequently using compost in vegetable production. And compost used in vegetable production, I want to mention too that the on-farm composting aspect is really important and very highly valued among a lot of the farmers we work with. So 54% of growers are composting frequently, using it as a long-term, using it to improve long-term soil health. 40% of growers are producing their own compost and really focusing on integrating it into overall farm planning. Compost use reflects a shift from really short-term nutrient needs to more sustainable conservation-based soil building practices. And I do want to mention too, for a lot of the urban farmers, the animal manure, some of those byproducts are often used less due to logistical, regulatory, and food safety concerns. So again, that may not be a realistic amendment or feedstock for some folks, but we do want to mention that for folks who are maybe looking to purchase off-site materials from nurseries and whatnot too, to maybe consider some of those depending on their soil health needs. In terms of the food security connection, I think there's some really clear direct impacts in terms of increasing local food production, lowering input costs. I mentioned that a little bit earlier as well. Improve crop yields and crop resilience. And indirect impacts I think often occur are stronger local economies, greater community control over food systems, and reduced reliance on supply chains. Again, this is just extremely popular right now, very relevant. It really kind of has been since the pandemic, the last several years, but I think this continues to be a really important piece. Social and community dimensions. I think this is really key, and I think Kate was really kind of drilling down on this in her presentation too, that these compost programs really succeed when residents are engaged. I know there's been a number of different residential composting programs in Indianapolis, other areas of the state that with limited success or limited buy-in. And so I think there's a lot of really unique takeaways there from just within Indiana we could look at. Trust and knowledge sharing. So again, there's the farmer peer networks are extremely valuable. I think sometimes in extension we maybe we focus a lot on that because we know how valuable they are. But I think again that when we're looking at a practice adoption or behavioral change, I think it's really important to evaluate the peer networks and how people are receiving information and sharing information. Cultural relevance. There are a lot of farmers I worked with in Indianapolis, like the Chin community, Hmong community in Milwaukee, many of the multi-generational gardens in Los Angeles or Seattle, that where composting practices really reflect community values, maybe traditions around food and land stewardship. So I think this is a really important piece too that can often get overlooked. And I did want to mention too that programs that integrate composting with food access initiatives, in particular food banks, some of the urban farms I support, they'll often link food waste reduction to reducing, or linking waste reduction to reducing hunger. I think this is a really important communication approach. They often emphasize it's not just about disseminating, information or flooding the zone with information or opportunities, but it's really about making that connection to building soil health, improving crop yields, and that leading to more food in the food system to get to vulnerable families so they can reduce hunger. And this topic just comes up quite a bit as really when they really hone in on that, it can really lead to a lot more buy-in or community participation because it's something tangible that people can relate to. In terms of some practical strategies to keep compost local here, it's really just establishing decentralized compost sites instead of one large facility. In reality, this can be very challenging, but I think this is something that a lot of the literature that I focus on, a lot of the partners I work with too, really are really trying to drill down on this and emphasize this more and more. Creating food scrap collection networks, like I mentioned earlier, with that Portland, Maine example is one, but there are many different examples to look at. Some new opportunities I've seen kind of emerge more in the last several years are community farmer partnerships, kind of compost for produce exchanges. Atlanta has a really excellent program. Asheville, North Carolina has a more recent one. Toronto has an amazing one too. So if that's of interest to you, please check those out. Also, too, want to mention integrating compost into municipal food security plans. Seattle and Burlington are kind of leaders in this, in Burlington, Vermont. Minneapolis, Cleveland has a more recent one, and Albuquerque, New Mexico has an amazing one as well. And I kind of want to just leave with, just kind of the big picture focus here is reframing, compost around waste can become a resource and really help retain nutrients on site, can be a real benefit for farmers. So With that, I want to wrap up and just say thank you. I want to thank the Institute for Sustainable Future, Dr. Engelberth, and everyone for putting together the webinar, the other speakers. Amazing information. Thank you for including me.
Excellent. So Nathan's presentation really brings us full circle from global systems all the way down to what individuals and communities can do. With that, we'll transition into questions and discussions, and I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. Let me see if we've got one in. So this is coming from a participant, and it says, I live in a senior community where the kitchen serves about 750 meals a day. How could they overcome barriers, or what could be our suggestions to establishing a pickup program, or how can second helpings travel for a pickup? If anyone wants to answer that.
I can answer that. I don't know where this person is located. I believe second helpings will just pick up within the sort of greater Indianapolis area, but there are some other organizations working in other parts of the state. I would suggest reaching out to Second Helpings through their website and just asking, either can you come to our senior community, or is there another organization similar to yours that you might be able to connect us with, because they'll know all of those folks.
Excellent. So as we wait for any more questions to come in, I'll go ahead and ask a few because I've got some lined up, don't worry. So we've heard a lot about food waste from the global systems all the way down to individual households. And from your perspective, where do you see the biggest disconnect between scale and action? Or where are we talking about solutions at the wrong level? And that's for anyone.
I guess I could answer from the food security perspective. One piece that is not answered yet that I think I'd love to have somebody take on is food banks are gathering food every day from grocery stores, from food that they've purchased and other major donors. And sometimes the food looks good until it's been in the cooler for a day, and then it really isn't edible anymore. And so they do have food waste. And I know that they struggle with figuring out how to get rid of food that they have on site that is not edible. And so I know Gleaner's Food Bank, which is in Indianapolis, has talked about trying to build some sort of major composting facility in collaboration with ag companies to be able to use that for fertilizer. Obviously, Nathan, not as the only source based on your presentation, but I think there is it's not what a hunger relief organization does. That's not the mission, but it is something that affects them. And I think it would be a great project to figure out how to get that food reused, even if it's not edible, to be composted and reused for ag or other uses. I know Second Helpings has a compost bin on site, so when they get food at their location that they can't use, they are composting it. And I think that has really been a pet project of one of their staff members, Nora. And I just think it's a problem that not a lot of the hunger relief organizations are capable of dealing with on their own.
One thing on the household side that I would note that I think ties into a lot of what Nathan was saying also, I think a big barrier is just awareness, right? So people don't want to admit that they're wasting food. It's not something, no one wants to do it. But I think when we have people even take 5 days to just track it, I think they're not always surprised at how much. I think sometimes they are more resourceful than they realize, but they do generate a lot of inedible waste. And I think they just don't even know what to do with it. And so it's at least a nice starter point of a conversation. Not that everyone's going to do their own home compost or anything like that, but it does make them realize, okay, edible food waste has very different solutions than inedible, and thinking about, like, does my community even have options available? And so to get kind of that buy-in and things like that at the community level, I do think awareness is a big key in trying to destigmatize just the act of like tracking what's going on at home to know what sort of solutions might be available.
Brenna, I want to build off your point. I think that's a really great way to say that. I think oftentimes, homeowners or stakeholders view it as a personal failure if their unable to do as much as they'd like, or even, figure out how to connect to these resources. And I think you mentioned in your presentation that aspect of perceived stress. I think that's a really great way to look at that, and in a kind of avoiding, I think in extension, sometimes we try to appeal to a lot of different people, or communication approaches are very one size fits all, where we're not really meeting people where they are in some of the situations. So I really like the approach you're taking within that study, where you're really trying to aim for that and kind of maybe create more customized interventions for people, because I think that's a really great way to fit into their lifestyle. And then they can disseminate that or share those results to their neighbors and family, friends, and whatnot too. And that may be more effective than even what we can do at a research or extension level.
Maybe I'll add from more like a global supply chain perspective, probably on more production side in the low-income countries, because that's where mostly due to technological availability, technological solutions, kind of there are quite substantial volumes of food loss, right? And often there is insufficient kind of financing there just to build, let's say, a new storage facility or update the equipment, but at the same time, potentially there could be some funding, for instance, from high-income countries to support that. But because there are no formal markets, for instance, for, food waste, for instance, kind of certificates like carbon markets, right? Where there is a carbon market for, permanent certificates, then it allows essentially high-income countries or funds invest in low-income countries, kind of support those activities. But essentially, in the case of food loss and waste, it's more like self-driven, country-driven, either initiatives or activities. So I think that's where potentially there is a gap in with introducing more kind of and potential of introducing more market-based kind of solutions, allowing for this kind of like funding exchange between more like global north and global south, and building on this potential in upper the supply chain.
Excellent, thank you. And we've got one more question from the audience. This is to Kate. How was food insecurity defined in your analysis?
So we use a USDA 2-question screener module, which asks, within the past 12 months, have you run out of food before you had money to buy more? And then the second question was, did you worry that you would run out of food before you had money to buy more? So it's looking at both whether you didn't have enough food and also whether you were concerned about it, because just that state of uncertainty is considered food insecurity. And then we also added some additional questions about whether the respondents had used food assistance programs, and then how many meals they missed. So we have some additional questions as well. And if you're interested in more details, our whole study is on our website. So if you go to indiehunger.org and select hunger studies, you can see both the most recent study in its full 80 plus pages. There's a summary of the study. At the end of the study is the entire survey, so you can see all the questions that we asked. I'm happy to answer more offline as well.
Excellent. So I was wondering, so we often talk about individual responsibility when it comes to food waste. Based on your work, where do behavior changes genuinely help? And where do we risk overburdening individuals instead of fixing systems?
I can take a first stab. Since we do households a lot, we do talk about individual responsibility. I guess some things I worry about is when we only rely on education. So I think like education is great and we need it, but sometimes there's more barriers than just education. So a lot of our work also thinks about like cooking, right? Because cooking can help us not only eat better, but it also might help us utilize the food we have and ideally reduce waste. And so we can give people education all day about how to cook, but if you are a food insecure household that doesn't have a sheet pan to roast vegetables, it doesn't have knives to chop and cook them, like that's also an issue. And so I think there sometimes when we only think about education, like we're missing these other pieces of the puzzle. And so again, like kind of reducing those financial barriers to help people do a better job. That's at least something we spend a lot of time thinking about. It's not just about education. It's about like these other structural constraints that might be happening for households.
Okay, so some of the people that were joining us today may care about reducing food waste, but feel unsure of where to start. What's one action that tends to be high impact and realistic for most individuals or communities?
I'll jump in. I think a big part of it is in Brenna's presentation, the food storage aspect of it too. I think that's a real challenge for people. They may not have, um, the materials, containers and whatnot to really properly package items to store them well. I think people want to, and I think they aim to, but I think it can be challenging for people. Like you mentioned, like the sheet pan. A lot of those things really are barriers to processing and storage too. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think those who are involved in food production, I think some of it is informational. I think maybe a lack of knowledge or experience in, properly composting. Let's just say that practice as an example. But I do think kind of reflecting in that structural barrier piece of it too. A lot of the things I mentioned, just the cost of purchasing compost or transporting it, and all those factors really play into it. And on the flip side of that, I don't want to get too off topic on soil testing too, but that is a whole other area too, where that's a huge cost burden for people too, of depending on how far they want to go into that, interpreting those results, how they then deal with that on the back end of that. And that again gets into that aspect of it's very site specific. That one size approach, I think, from an extension standpoint or a soil management aspect, doesn't always fit everybody too. So yeah, I think that's an important thing to consider too. It's both the food prep and food storage, but if you're involved in food production, the structural costs can be a big barrier.
Yeah, I would kind of go back to what I said earlier. I think if you don't know where to start, I think the best place to start is to just track it and see what's actually happening at your house, only if it's for a few days. But the other thing that I always like to advocate for is being realistic planner for yourself and like giving yourself grace. So my downfall is I'm an optimistic vegetable buyer. I always think my kids will eat them and I will cook them. And like, so this is my downfall. And so at the end of the day, if you know that 2 nights a week, you're gonna be like, never mind, let's do takeout, like just make it part of your plan. And it's okay. And like give yourself grace instead of saying, I expect myself to follow through on cooking 5 or 6 nights a week. So I just always encourage like being realistic and having a little grace with yourself as well, especially on like the shopping and planning side.
Maybe
That's so true, Brenna. I mean, I found even having I have a planner that's just like a pad of paper that says, okay, here's what I plan to cook and here's the grocery list. Since I've started doing that, it's helped like just really think about what you were saying, like being realistic about what you're going to eat. And it's often hard to suppress the pressure of your family's saying, but mom, I don't want that. I want this.
maybe just to add a couple points from my side. So in terms of specific, well, not that much, interventions, but more like pieces of information that was useful in terms of kind of how people interpret food waste was kind of differences between best by and use by or due date. So at least in the studies that we have been kind of involved into, have been find that there have been many confusions between that. So people were interpreting kind of best by date as a due date and just throwing out food. And then, okay, if best by date is past, how long can you kind of consume it? So those were like pretty practical kind of questions that often were making quite a bit of a difference, right? But then also adding to a previous question in terms of like behavioral changes versus specific interventions, at least from kind of like our more, like system perspective work, what we have been finding is that like in general food system, in order to change, at least from, like more consumption perspective, really should rely much more on behavioral changes rather than policy interventions, because food demand is so inelastic. So it's very different from many other markets, like, I don't know, energy markets, environmental markets, right? Where you can impose regulations in a much more kind of efficient manner. While in the case of food kind of consumption patterns and waste as well, it's much more driven by kind of consumer itself. And those preferences, we looked into, I don't know, like 50, 60 years of history and looked into how diets have been changing. We managed to identify 1 or 2 countries where diets have actually improved over time. So it's really challenging despite all the policies and so on. And same with food loss and waste, right? So I just wanted to point out that kind of distinction. Of course, there are countries where succeeded more. So for instance, waste sorting, not only food, but also industrial kind of in Italy, for instance, in much more kind of like advanced system itself, it's much more complicated. So, it has been bringing some benefits. So that could be, for instance, one option where things could improve in the US itself in terms of, availability of sorting and so on. But still, it's the nature of the system that kind of like it's complicates things substantially.
Okay, so looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what gives you the most optimism about reducing food waste? And what concerns do you have if we just stay on the current path we're on?
I think optimism, I think, is that we are still continuing to see investment from like the government and state side on at least the diversion. Like I think we are doing better to invest in keeping it out of the landfills, which is like the most harmful thing to the environment. I guess something that concerns me is despite all of the really positive progress, we actually, and Maksym may be able to speak to this more, like just getting good data on how much food waste is happening is actually really hard. And so to know if we're truly making progress, like that's what concerns me. So we have these sustainable development goals, but a lot of times the data quality that we have is sometimes in question. And so it's really hard to know like if we're moving the needle and often what's moving the needle. So I think sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly what we should be doing more of sometimes. So.
Maybe I can add, yeah. I mean, what Brenna mentioned in terms of data availability, that's a huge challenge. And, that's a huge challenge in high-income countries, including in US, but like let alone, low-income countries. There, the data tracking is really a, major gap. And of course, if you do not track it, how can you address it if you don't know what you're addressing, right? But, with that, even with limited data, whatever we have available, we have not really seen a good kind of trends towards improvements, like substantial improvements. So maybe there is, but more on the margins considering the data availability. And once we, project going forward, like 10, 20 years and beyond, if historical kind of composition of consumption and so on continues, as food loss and waste would increase. So again, it's challenging in terms of continuation of their status quo. So obviously, much more need to be done. In terms of like where I see potential optimism, I would note that I might be somewhat optimistic about some of their new industrial opportunities, that might be arising. So more through market-based mechanisms and some solutions in terms of reusing, for new applications. And there are quite a bit of developments in this area, maybe not that much kind of commercialized, but I think that could be one solution or one option that we have not been really like considering in addition to changing consumption behavior and so on, which hopefully, could help.
I think what gives me hope is I'm just hearing a lot more people talking about food waste. There are a lot of nonprofits in our network that are including it in their strategic plan. How can they address food waste and reduce food waste because they're moving food every day? And then even the city government in Indianapolis is thinking about when their waste contract comes up for renewal, how can they integrate composting at a city level into that plan? Something that we desperately need. As Nathan mentioned, there have been lots of sort of small nonprofits or companies trying to offer household composting, and they haven't really gotten off the ground. And I think we really need a bigger plan. And so hearing that at least it's being talked about is what gives me hope.
Yeah, I would echo what everyone has kind of said so far, where I think just even the anecdotal information, we have from extension or from collaborating with farmers it's a big priority for many of the farmers. They want to be, good stewards of the land. They want to, practice, many different soil health principles, and composting fits right into those principles too. But I think even in, the last 6 or 7 years, not just due to the pandemic, there's a big influx of new farmers and people who are interested in at-home food production and a lot of these topics. But I think we see it reflected more even in the funding opportunities now, which I don't remember seeing that as often even 5 to 10 years ago. So there are a lot more funding opportunities geared at food waste or at composting in general too. So I think they're seeing really opportunities there, really reflecting those interests from farmers and stakeholders too. So I'm really optimistic about that too. And I think when we're I think again, kind of going back to the point of like food prices, high, potential fuel shortages, it tends to lead people into wanting to conserve more and to, stretch things further. And so food falls right into that category too. Hear that echoed a lot in all the conversations we're having with farmers right now.
Okay, so last question, real quick. So if you're speaking to someone who cares deeply about food waste but feels overwhelmed by the complexity of the system, what's one thing you want to remember and keep in mind as they leave today?
I'll go first. I think the individual actions still matter, right? Like I think each person in their own home can make small changes that make a difference. So I guess it is overwhelming and there's lots of moving parts, but I guess like the individual actions do add up, and you gotta start somewhere. So that would be at least something I would mention.
Well, I think what I'm going to take away from today is to try to be a better planner. In my own home, I have the same problem that Brenna mentioned, where, the week gets busy and, soccer practice moves or something comes up that you weren't expecting and you don't end up cooking the thing you thought you were going to cook. And so trying to build that uncertainty into the plan, I think, is something that I personally will try to do differently after today.
Yeah, so I'll add that from more like a systems also perspective, it's important to identify like key priority areas of interventions or key hotspots, and it's both on the individual and household level. So like identify the key areas where you can improve, but same from global system perspective, right? So essentially, where is return on your action investment the highest, right? And make an action there rather than try to address everything, because this is a super heterogeneous kind of system, as we have shown, right? So you can't address everything at the same time. You really need to pick priorities. So sometimes it's not easy, but that's the way to go.
Yeah, and I think even and looking at the local level or at small scale individual level too, kind of going back to that point of it. Yeah, it's not a failure on someone's part if they don't get to where they wanted to get to, or they have one setback, or like you just mentioned, the reality of the week getting ahead of you with getting takeout. It's a great example. But yeah, that gap between perception and reality sometimes too, I think for a lot of people is much different than what they really think. And so really trying to talk with people, share resources, generate awareness, and really kind of figure out, what is preventing them from doing what they want to do? What is getting, what are those barriers? And really kind of help either illuminate other paths forward or provide other resources to make that easier for folks. And so I think a lot of people, the other speakers today shared different ways to do that too, which I think is really helpful for me to think about moving forward as well.
All right. Well, I think that is about the time we have for today. So we've heard a lot about food waste as a global systems challenge and as something that shapes policy and as something individuals engage with every day. I want to really thank our speakers for giving such excellent presentations and so informative. Events like this are really at the heart of ISF's mission. It brings together research, practice, community to address complex sustainability challenges in ways that are actionable and inclusive. And I hope that today's conversation gave you new ways to think about food waste and new entry points for engagement, whether in your work, your community, or in your own backyard. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future ISF Impact Series event.
Thanks, Abby. And just as a final note, we will be sending out the link. We will be posting this important conversation on our ISF YouTube page. And so we can continue to share this out with friends who may not have been able to meet with us today. I know it's a very challenging time. Everyone's out with a beautiful day, maybe celebrating some birthday events outside as well. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, Abby, for your great work as facilitator.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.